everyone, and once again, welcome to this session of Leto Lectures. As we continue to make our way towards Election Day, November 3rd, part of our year-long series, The Presidency 2020. Now, by this point, we've looked at the office of President of the United States, if you think about it, from just about every conceivable perspective that I could think of in planning a series of this type. We've spent lots of time looking at the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and the role that it had in creating not only the office of President, but creating branches that would interact with our chief executive, and then, of course, balancing power between the federal government and the individual states. We've looked at the nature of American politics and looked at the good, the ugly, and the really bad of political parties and the calcifying effect it has on the emergence of new areas of policy in dealing with all the important issues we face at this time. We looked at some of those issues. We've looked at firearm policy, healthcare, immigration, always contentious, passionate issues come election time. We've looked at some foreign policy challenges that any person who becomes America's president has to be ready to deal with on day one. We've looked at the always changing set of alliances and relationships in the Middle East. We've considered the China challenge, which poses the most comprehensive set of challenges to American leaders today, and I suspect will continue to do so throughout the remainder of this century. We're still preparing to talk about Russia and North Korea and the separate, distinct challenges they pose to anyone who might hold the office of President of the United States. We've done several presidential biographies looking at the lives of those who eventually came to be considered noteworthy, distinguished American presidents, ranging all the way back from George Washington, more closely looking at presidents like Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman. How popular a president might be during his time in office and when he leaves office, and even for years following his time in office, doesn't necessarily freeze that president in any particular status, great, mediocre, or terrible, because oftentimes presidential legacies are built on the passage of time, showing the brilliance, if that's the right word, of decisions presidents made earlier. We've looked, of course, at how nominating conventions held by Democrats and Republicans have been these bizarre, unusual, highly unconventional conventions, usually, again, broadcast through some type of remote visual medium. And throughout this year, we've commented on how the coronavirus and the disease, the illness, COVID-19, has so disrupted not only our lives and our way of lives, and disrupted the ways in which we meet, necessitating all of this videotaping and lighting and all of these unusual ways to communicate this information. It's disrupted the American workforce, it's disrupted the American economy, and of course has created, only in America, this great battle of opinions between politicians, oftentimes seeking more expedient political solutions to problems, and doctors and epidemiologists and healthcare professionals who are trained to look at more tried and true scientific long-term solutions to the challenges which we face. Now, today, we are going to look at politics in the United States in a more basic way, in a more granular way. We are going to examine the long journey that women in the United States waged in order to gain the universal right to vote and implicitly to hold elective office, and then look back in the last 100 years. August was the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women, again, universal suffrage. But where exactly have we gone in the last 100 years as a population in allowing, in electing women to serve in important leadership positions in the United States? Now, if we didn't have the benefit of history regarding this subject in the United States, if we lived in a United States that was domed and blocked off from how countries other than the United States govern and whom they're governed by, we might look at the times that we live in today and say, boy, haven't we gone a long way? You've gone a long way, baby, to get where you've got to today. As the old cigarette commercial, remember those when they were allowed to appear on television, used to say, because we would look today at the 435-person House of Representatives and say the elections of 2018, the 2018 midterms, were record-setting, because today there are 101 women serving in the 435-member House of Representatives. By far a high watermark, but in reality, just a mere 23% of all individuals who sit in that legislative body, 101. In the Senate, it's even better. 26 of the 100 members of the United States Senate are women. 26%, the highest it's ever been. Whoop-de-doo, good for us. We're well on the road to gender equality in representing our country. Now, in the last few decades, 1984, a big year in that Walter Mondale, the Democratic nominee, for the very first time selected a female running mate in the person of Representative Geraldine Ferraro of the state of New York. For reasons other than who Mondale selected as his running mate in 1984, he would go on to suffer one of the greatest landslide defeats to Ronald Reagan, who won a second term as President of the United States. In 2008, it was the Republicans' turn to break the mold when nominee John McCain selected then Alaska Governor Sarah Palin to serve as his running mate. And we all remember that that was similarly a bad campaign for John McCain. In that election, in fact, history was made when Barack Obama became the first person of African ancestry to be elected President of the United States. 4 years ago, things appeared to be getting even better when Hillary Clinton became the Democratic nominee for the presidency, the first time a woman has been selected to top the ticket of a major party in a presidential election. We know, of course, that in November of 2016, she lost a very close race to the incumbent president, Donald Trump. Just in the last month or so, we've seen history of another sorts made when Kamala Harris, the senator from California, was chosen by Joe Biden to serve as his running mate, Kamala Harris being the first woman of color to appear on either the Democratic or the Republican Party ticket for President of the United States. Boy, upward and onward might be the belief if we lived in a vacuum. But in fact, we know that beyond America's shores, we've seen countries in various stages of development, some developing countries, some young countries, some older countries, more steeped in democracy, have seen women rise to the top of the heap, depending on the system of government, either becoming president of a country or in parliamentary systems, being selected to serve as prime minister or chancellor, the head of government, the equivalent to the president in countries that practice parliamentary democracy. Long ago, in the 1960s, more than 50 years ago, Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, elected a woman as prime minister in 1961. In 1966, one of the two most populous countries in the world's largest democracy, India, saw Indira Gandhi become prime minister of the nation of India. And in 1969, in a country, Israel, 21 years in existence, Golda Meir would reach the top of the heap, becoming the prime minister of the Israeli state. We've seen since then, of course, notable women like Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, Angela Merkel, the current chancellor of Germany. And way down south of the border, way south in the continent of South America, places that Americans sometimes call banana republics. It's not a compliment, by the way. We've seen countries like Peru, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina each democratically elect women to serve as president of those countries. So, by comparison, the United States, the country that gave the world Western-style liberal democracy, a system in which people of all races, ideally, are treated equally, where religious tolerance is the norm, where the press is free to write about whatever they choose to write about. I think that's still the case here in the United States, where people are able to form up political parties, not as well here, but in other places around the world, and run slates of candidates for office. And yes, we gave the world liberal democracy that came to mean people being treated equally on the basis of gender, something that we know is not really the case in much of the American work environment. Maybe in professional occupations, things have gotten more equal, but we know quite certainly that women have lagged behind in rising to higher elective offices. America has been deprived, perhaps, of having the more numerous gender of among our population, women, contribute to important decisions of war and peace, of domestic policy, of healthcare and education in sufficient numbers so that they might offer alternatives to what has been a largely male-dominated American political environment at the national, state, and local level. And we think about this and maybe ponder that in many ways, How in the world could this be the case? Without belaboring the nature of our country's founding, we recognize that between 1776 and 1791, the same generation of men, and yes, they were all men, most of whom had either been born in Great Britain or were British by ancestry, would gather in various combinations, mostly in Philadelphia, to give the United States, within 15 years' time, its three founding documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. We know, of course, that the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, managed to synthesize and so well write about some of the most inspiring, progressive political theory that happened to be bouncing around between the United States and capitals in Europe for the previous 100 years. So it would be Jefferson's brilliance which would deliver to us in the Declaration of Independence some of the most immortal language regarding the universal rights of man and the nature of representative government. If any of us ever had to remember and recite parts of these documents, probably the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is the most memorable. It's the one that begins with the assertion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To ensure these rights, Jefferson continued, governments are established deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, not from God or some ancestor. He went on to suggest that governments who disserve their citizenry, don't enable them to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, have the right to remove that government and create new government, which would better permit citizens to pursue their earthly goals. Now, at the time these documents were written, and for nearly 100 years in America's early history, those words truly were aspirational. They were goals. They were ideals. Because we know, for instance, number one, women were not invited to take part in the writing of any of these documents. Number two, we know that, like Thomas Jefferson, at the time, a large number of the framers of our founding documents were slave owners, owning, selling, breeding other people who, again, the assertion was, were created equal. At the time these documents were written, the delegates to these conventions where they were written were some of the best educated, they were some of the most worldly, they were some of the best read, and they were some of the wealthiest men in their particular colonies. They were not gods, saints, sent down to deliver these documents to us, like the tablets that the commandments were written on. They were men who were products of their time, men who perhaps had the foresight to suggest how a government might ideally be created, and to suggest that everyone living in that government should be treated equally. But by no means, at the time of the writing of these documents, and then of the Constitution, and then the Bill of Rights, were any of those beliefs actually incorporated into our founding documents as written. Native Americans, the indigenous peoples, were explicitly in the Constitution denied the right to vote. We know that for the purposes of delivering seats to individual states after a census, not only were slaves unable to vote, a slave counted not as a whole person, but 3/5 of a person, all the way up to the census of 1860, the year before the beginning of the Civil War. And we know, of course, that in most states, women were viewed as insufficiently equal to their male peers to vote and to hold or seek and hold elective office. In fact, for a very long time, the universe of individuals in most states who could vote and who could hold office were not the broad category of all men, but only men who owned land. That was the nature of all of the individuals who could participate in this great system. Again, aspirationally laid out. Maybe the framers believed that over time, those words would ring true to more of America's population. So the calendar turns to 1800, 1810, 1820, and the United States begins to grow as more and more states are added to the Union. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 would accelerate the settlement of frontier areas and the geographic and population growth of the United States. In the election of 1824 for president, it might be said that for the very first time, a common man, someone who was not a founding father or was not a Virginian or had not come from a highly cultivated background, as predecessor presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe had, in 1824, John Quincy Adams, the son of our second president, John Adams, a man who by many accounts was considered to have the highest IQ of any person to ever hold the office, faced off against Andrew Jackson, a retired general, now a wealthy plantation owner, a slave owner, coming from one of the non-original 13 states of Tennessee. Jackson ended up losing that election in a vote in the House of Representatives. There were several candidates. No candidate won an outright majority of all the electoral votes. So in this very restrictive environment of 1824, Jackson was the victim of laws in many states that did not enable common men, non-landowners, to vote. Between the election of 1824 and 1828, Jackson and others would bring about a sea change when state after state after state began to remove the land-owning requirement from voting laws, which had the effect by 1828 of greatly increasing the pool of those eligible to vote, increasing it with lots of working men and common men. And in the election of 1828, Jackson routed John Quincy Adams in a rematch to become America's 7th president. Now, by this time, the United States was in a period relative to religion that historians call the Second Great Religious Awakening, beginning sometime in the early 1820s and lasting all the way into the 1850s. We would see Americans overwhelmingly, of course, Protestant, begin to practice a more literal, evangelical version of their faith. Church attendance would increase. I suspect the baskets that were passed, were filling up with more coins. And people began looking to religious leaders to lead the way in making the United States a more moral country. So it was during this time, the 1820s, the beginning of America's second great religious awakening, that we would see, number one, an acceleration of a move to abolish slavery. The original sin of the United States, as some call it, as an abomination, as a slur to the words on America's founding documents. And at the same time, in the 1820s, preachers would begin to rail against the evils of alcohol and the idea that oftentimes young boys not going to school, going to work, would exist on a diet of alcohol. Wake up with a drink in the morning, have another drink at lunch, maybe end the day with yet another drink as well. Alcohol in religious terms was portrayed as not just something that caused men to squander their wages, to become unhealthy, to sometimes fight and lose their lives younger than they should, leaving behind widows and orphans. In religious terms, alcohol was portrayed by evangelical pastors as a demon that had been sent by Satan to eviscerate the soul of a man. So during this period of time, we would see, particularly outside of the Deep South concerning slavery, a great uptick in activism and a great organizing of efforts to bring about the abolition of slavery and the prohibition of the manufacture and sale of intoxicating beverages. Now, during this period of time, women were very much treated as chattels, once they married, possessions of their husbands. They couldn't vote, but they sat in church week after week after week. They were devout and believed in the ills regarding slavery and temperance and other important issues, but could not actively seek office, much less vote for candidates promising perhaps to either promote or oppose movements like abolition and temperance. The men gathered in church. The pastor led the discussion. The men talked about what was going to be done at the local level to oppose these issues. Some few brave women who raised their hands and tried to take part in these conversations were often told, lady, we'll let you stay here and listen, but sit down and be quiet. You're not able to participate. But slowly but surely, women would find their first opportunities to participate in any way, in any issues that were political, as activists, organizing, rallying, promoting causes, maybe raising money, even though they couldn't vote, nor even though they could not seek elective office. So through the 1820s, and then the 1830s and the 1840s, some of the first women that we would later come to regard as leaders at the vanguard of the women's suffrage movement. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony became notable activists. Generally, we would see that these women would start their careers as activists promoting some other cause, wide and varied causes: abolition, temperance, the creation of public schools, reforms of prisons and mental hospitals, the restrictions on child labor, and eventually formed the nucleus of a group that would simultaneously clamor for the right of women to seek and hold elective office and to vote. So the woman as an activist became more of a phenomenon during this period of time, and it was really amazing to see that this activism was often multifaceted, not just, and in many cases, not initially focusing on rights concerning women. We would see, for instance, notable activists like Stanton, like Lucretia Mott, like Harriet Tubman, like Sojourner Truth, not only oppose slavery, but become abolitionist proponents as well. Lucy Webb Hayes, Susan B. Anthony, Frances Willard, Carrie Nation, the woman that with the hatchet that would go into bars and break up liquor bottles, would be noted suffragettes, but they were also among the leaders of the temperance movement as it began to grow, certainly towards the latter part of the 19th century. Dorothea Dix, Jane Addams, Lillian Wald became involved in prison reform, in housing reform. Jane Addams building Hull House, a prototype settlement house in Chicago, a way to help newly arrived Americans accelerate their assimilation into the American nation of people. Ida Wells, a journalist at the turn of the last century, African American, bravely traveled to the South to document and write about and oppose the lynching of African Americans under Jim Crow laws in southern states. Margaret Sanger, in the early 20th century, would become a leading proponent in the birth control movement. Margaret Sanger, we now know, helped bring about better knowledge of women's reproductive systems and how to prevent pregnancies. She said, to help prevent poor, ignorant immigrant women from reproducing themselves into shorter and poorer lives, we now know that there's a lot of evidence that Margaret Sanger also believed in the pseudoscience of eugenics, and that if you get fewer of these inferior types of people to reproduce, the odds were they would over time create fewer offspring of that same inferior type. So by the early 1840s, women were off, beginning this career as a gender of activism. And by 1846, the United States had gone off and started a war with Mexico. A war in large part driven by this great evangelizing of the second great religious awakening, as demonstrated by the term manifest destiny. A devout writer, an editorial writer for a newspaper in Chicago, suggested that God had intended the United States to dominate not just those territories that we already owned, but the whole of North America. Somewhere along the line, God must have said, leave Canada alone. So we didn't really focus in that direction. It's cold, Canadians are bad tippers. For whatever reasons, Canada was never in the crosshairs there. But that was very much a war driven again by this fervor. So it's not coincidental that in July of 1848, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott organized the gathering in Seneca Falls, New York, that came to be known as the first Women's Rights Convention. The beginning of a more organized, focused women's suffrage movement can be traced back to this meeting in Seneca Falls. You may remember that as President Obama was giving his second inaugural address in 2012, he used some very alliterative language to talk about important American civil rights types movement by saying from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, showing how these venues were places where women's suffrage, an acceleration of civil rights laws, and of course Stonewall is a bar in Greenwich Village in New York where in 1969 gay patrons refused to be bullied and arrested, and the beginning of the modern gay rights movement is often traced back to the Stonewall Inn in 1969. So at the Seneca Falls Conference, more than 100 delegates gathered, male and female. Frederick Douglass was not only present there, he spoke there, and he signed a document that was released there. And it was at the Seneca Falls Conference that Elizabeth Cady Stanton would read and publish a document that she had written. It's known as the Declaration of Sentiments. If you have a handout, it's contained there. It quite simply was one of the most brilliant pieces of political writing in American history, in that it traced the structure and the language of the Declaration of Independence to more particularly make the cause for not emancipation, but for equal status for women, which in 1848 they clearly did not enjoy. It's organized just like the Declaration of Independence, with an introductory paragraph, a second paragraph that sets out principles and truths, and then it contains a list of grievances, like the Declaration of Independence, which of course pointed out specific egregious acts that the British government had committed against colonial residents. It's not too long, and I'd like to read a couple of the notable parts of it. It begins just like the Declaration, and in many cases, almost word for word, with a few gender-based changes here and there. Declaration of Sentiments. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. Almost exactly like the first paragraph of the Declaration. She goes on, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it and to insist upon the institution of new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Again, very similar to the Declaration. She goes on. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed, word for word. But when the long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of the women under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So following these propositions, Stanton goes on to express not grievances as we call that long laundry list of complaints in the Declaration. She refers to them as sentiments. Here are a few of them. 1, he has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise, to vote. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she has no voice. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. It's quite a shot there, if you think about it. Having deprived her of this first right as a citizen, the right to vote, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. He has made her, if married, in the eyes of the law, civilly dead. He has taken from her all right in property, even to the wages she earns. This is a great one here now. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. Think about that one for a while. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of liberty and to administer chastisement. A few more. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall constitute the proper causes of divorce in the case of separation, to whom the guardianship of children shall be given, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of the woman. The law in all cases going upon a false supremacy false supposition of the supremacy of a man and giving all power into his hands. After depriving her of all rights as a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. Think about that one. He has monopolized nearly all profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives a scanty remuneration. He closes her against all avenues of wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable to himself. As a teacher of theology, medicine, or law, she is not known. Every year for about the last 10 years, by the way, all across the country, more women graduate from medical school, law school, and dental school, and engineering schools than do men. So this grievance clearly has been resolved. He allows her in church as well as state, but a subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority to exclude her from the ministry, and with some exceptions from any public participation in the affairs of the church. He has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies which exclude women from any public society are not only tolerated, but deemed of little account in man. Imagine that, a double standard. He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Now, the conclusion, and I'll abbreviate it to one paragraph, sort of is what women expect based on the case that was made earlier. Just like the Declaration has a concluding paragraph as well. Now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half of the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. This document was signed, and make no mistake, this Declaration of Sentiments, July of 1848, became the foundation, the guiding light that would drive the movement forward, where finally, 72 years later, by virtue of the 19th Amendment, women would receive the universal right to vote. We know, however, that the 1850s was not a decade to fully begin a discussion of women's voting rights and citizenship rights, because as we've noted before, 1850s was the decade where at the federal level and at many state levels, things began falling apart. Abolitionism was the key issue regarding any type of social issue, and whether or not slavery should be abolished wasn't even the issue. The issue was whether or not new states admitted to the Union would be able to introduce the institution of slavery there. So we know what happened. Civil War began 1861, ended 4 years later, 1865. Women often stuck in or near battlefields, again, I think played an unsung role in the fighting that went on that ultimately took the lives of what we now believe were nearly 800,000 men, women, and children during these 4 years of fighting. The Union prevailed, April 1865. A little earlier, in January of 1863, in the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln, through an executive order, had emancipated slaves only in those 11 states that had seceded from the Union. It did not explicitly affect the status of slaves in states that had remained loyal to the Union, but still maintained the institution. Places like Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. So it was known that as the Civil War came to an end, there would have to be some amending done to the Constitution to wipe away forever the institution of slavery from the United States. And that was not achieved until December of 1865, when states ratified the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery. In 1867, the 14th Amendment, among other things, confirmed citizenship on all of those now emancipated former slaves who were not, in the eyes of the law, full American citizens. And then finally, and here is where the abolitionists pinned a tremendous amount of hope, an amendment had to be considered conferring the right to vote on these former slaves, now citizens. In Congress, where the constitutional amendment process begins, a number of suggested amendments were put forward, but ironically, the greatest resistance to an amendment which in 1868 would have given women the right to vote came from states in the Northeast, where maybe members of Congress were fearful of women suddenly beginning to run for and hold elective office. So imagine the horror and the disappointment when the amendment that Congress submitted to the states, that was ratified in 1868, said only, "The right to vote shall not be abridged or denied on the basis of race, color, or condition of previous servitude." If the word gender had been included in those rights, the 19th Amendment would not have been necessary. So in theory, going forward, and soon in former Southern Confederate states, this truly was more theoretical. Only male former slaves, male African Americans, were able to assert the right to vote because women as a gender were still excluded. So the movement that had been building was deflated. The leaders of this rights movement splintered, forming two organizations which for about 20 years pursued suffrage in two different ways. The first, the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, continued to pursue amending the federal Constitution as a way to give women the right to vote with one fell swoop. Every year, beginning in 1869, a universal suffrage amendment was presented to Congress. Only in 1919, 50 years later, did it receive sufficient votes from Congress to be sent to the states for their consideration. The second group saw an opportunity to go state by state by state, maybe even into territories, and bring about the amending of state and territorial constitutions so that at least in that state or territory, women living there would be able to vote. The second group, the American Women's Suffrage Association, most notably led by Lucy Stone, pursued this right again on a state by state by state basis with some early victories. The Wyoming Territory in 1869 would be the first entity in the United States in its Constitution to give women the right to vote. The Idaho Territory would follow in 1870. Colorado in 1893 would be the first state in its Constitution to give women the right to vote, followed by Idaho in 1896. By 1890, the United States was in the midst of great change. In the midst, of course, of this great wave of immigration that either we have or will talk about in another lecture. And it happened to bring primarily families from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, the poorest and the most poorly governed places in Europe, where women as a gender were treated very poorly. And the lack of education, the lack of literacy in English, in their own native languages in some cases, were tremendous impediments to these families being integrated into the American population. So just like during an earlier era, we would see leaders of the suffragette movement once again embrace social causes in large part for the benefit to help these newly arrived poor immigrant families better assimilate into the American nation of people. So we would see, for instance, the continued pursuit of prohibition, of the temperance movement, because boy, did these immigrants seem to drink a lot of booze. We would see calls for housing reform, workplace safety, after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911 in particular, restriction of child labor, birth control. Margaret Sanger would come around during this period of time, and compulsory education so that the children of immigrants would have an opportunity to be better educated Americans. So this would take place when right around 1900, particularly after Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States in 1901, that America would begin a 20-year period in its history that we now refer to as the Progressive Era. It was a time where in many circles, among citizen activists, among elected officials at the state and local level, among journalists and book publishers and publishers of periodicals, newspapermen, there was a recognition that the United States, since the end of the Civil War, was a country that had changed so profoundly, and in some cases, by 1900, was a country unrecognizable from the country that had existed just 35 years before. Industrialization, urbanization, massive immigration, primarily being the reasons, these reformers believed there was a need for systematic reform of a multitude of institutions within the United States. So during this period of time, and even more specifically between 1910 and 1920, we would see the Constitution amended 4 times, a very aggressive pace of changing or adding to our nation's governing document, the Constitution, by amendment. The framers of the Constitution were pretty self-confident. They believed that the Constitution they had written had struck all the proper balances and checks that they believed necessary, and were determined to make it a very difficult document to change. The official language is to amend. So unlike a state like Florida, where our Constitution gets amended just about every time there is a statewide election, in order to amend our Constitution, there's a couple of ways it can be done, but the only way the Constitution has been amended the 27 times it has in our history is through the following process. Number one, each House of Congress, by a 2/3 vote, must approve the same identical language of a proposed amendment. That means today 67 senators and probably more than 280 members of the House. Good luck trying to get an amendment approved these days. That used to be the easy part. Because if 2/3 of each House proposes the language, approves the language of a proposed amendment, that amendment is then sent to the states. The president does not play a role at all in the amendment process to the United States Constitution. So that proposed amendment is sent to the states, where in some time frame, usually specified in the proposed amendment, 3/4, that means today 38 state legislatures have to vote to ratify that amendment. When 3/4 do, that amendment immediately becomes part of the Constitution. So, 1913, the 17th Amendment is ratified by the states. The 16th Amendment is ratified by the states, creating the federal income tax, at the time directed to the top 1% of the top 1%, those great malfeasors of wealth, as Theodore Roosevelt had referred to them, to disgorge them of some of their enormous wealth. That's sort of changed in the last 100 years or so. In 1913, the very same year, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, which for the very first time called for the direct election of United States senators by citizens of the states they had represented. From the ratification of the Constitution until 1913, United States senators, unlike House members, were not elected by state citizens, but were selected by state legislatures, which during the Progressive era were recognized to be, in many cases, state legislatures, some of the most corrupt entities mankind had ever created, senators directly elected. In 1919, the great goal of the temperance movement resulted in the ratification of the 18th Amendment. In a tremendous effort at lobbying, pressure on Congress, Congress sent to the states language which soon, garnering 36 votes out of then 48 states, would cause prohibition to be enacted via an act of Congress called the Volstead Act in 1919. And then it turns out, finally, as the door was closing on the progressive period, the election of 1920 would bring about a great sea change in who was the president and which party controlled Congress. In June of 1919, finally, 2/3 of each House of Congress sent to the states the proposed language of a 19th Amendment. A little more than a year later, August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the all-important 36th state. Several wavering members of the Tennessee legislature very heavily leaned on and lobbied by their suffragette spouses, mothers, and daughters, getting to that magical threshold, 75%. And on that day, in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, which simply says the right to vote shall not be abridged or denied on the basis of gender. Women were able to vote just several months later in the national elections of 1920. And what did they do? They went out and elected Warren G. Harding as president. No, that's a joke. It's a joke. It really is. And then we would see milestones reached as women could now more broadly seek elective office. In 1917, because Montana had amended its constitution to permit women to seek elective office, Jeannette Rankin would be sworn in as the first female member of the United States House of Representatives. In 1968, a candidate from New York, Shirley Chisholm, would serve as the first African American female elected to serve in the United States House of Representatives. She'd actually been elected in 1966, and we know in 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first African American female to seek a major party nomination as she ran for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. In 2007, and then again in 2019, following elections in 2006 and in 2018, where Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives, Nancy D'Alessandro Pelosi was selected by Democrats in the House to serve as the first and thus far only female Speaker of the House of Representatives. Second in line in the succession to hold the office of president. And up until this point, I think it could be said, the most powerful woman to hold office in either of the two elective branches of our government, Congress and, of course, the executive branch. We've not yet had a female president or vice president. In 1933, a Arkansan by the name of Hattie Caraway, who had very naturally embraced the populist rhetoric of the senator from Louisiana, Arkansas's neighboring state to the south, Huey Long, and at a time when the United States was experiencing the depths of the Great Depression, Hattie Caraway, with Huey Long's support, would be legally, legitimately elected to serve a 6-year term in the United States Senate. In the 20s, spouses of a male senator who died would honorifically be permitted to serve out their term. Hattie Caraway sought, announced, and won several terms, by the way, in the United States Senate from Arkansas. A notable female member of the United States Senate would be Margaret Chase Smith from Maine, who served from 1949 until 1973, notably the first Republican in the Senate to publicly call out Joseph McCarthy of engaging in dangerous demagoguery. Margaret Chase Smith was also a woman who was encouraged to seek the Republican nomination for the presidency both in 1960 and then in 1964, something that she refused to actively do. In 1992, Carol Moseley Braun from the state of Illinois would become the first African-American woman elected to serve in the United States Senate. And now that I think about it, she really is still the only African-American woman to serve in the United States Senate. In 2012, Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin became the first openly gay female to win election to the United States Senate, coming from Wisconsin, the Badger State. 1971, Oklahoma City was the first of America's 50 largest cities to elect a female. Her name was Patrice Latting as its mayor. Later, 1979 would be a banner year wherein in Chicago, Jane Byrne, and in San Francisco, Dianne Feinstein would both be elected mayors of their respective cities. Large, vibrant, dynamic cities in the United States. In 1946, President Harry Truman appointed Franklin Delano Roosevelt's widow, Eleanor Roosevelt, to serve as America's delegate to the just created United Nations. Before that position was made a full ambassadorial position. In 1981, Ronald Reagan would appoint Jeane Kirkpatrick to serve in that capacity. Again, the first female American ambassador to the UN. We've subsequently seen ladies like Samantha Powers under President Obama, and more recently, Nikki Haley, be the person representing the United States in the UN. In 1981, maybe in one of the most glaring deprivations in American government, in 1981, Ronald Reagan nominated Sandra Day O'Connor to serve as a justice on the United States Supreme Court. By that time, the United States had had, I think, exactly 100 individuals who had served on the Supreme Court since it was created and enacted in the Constitution. All 100 had been men until Sandra Day O'Connor broke that ceiling, as it were. President Clinton would later nominate Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who still is a member, of course, of the court. And then President Obama would appoint both Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, who would be confirmed subsequently as Supreme Court justices. 4 out of the now 113 persons to serve in the Supreme Court have been women, 3 of them still current occupants of that court. So again, today, if one lived, under a shell, they'd say, look at that, 23% of the members of the House, 101 of them are women. In the history of the House, there have been 359 women, individual, who have served in this 435-seat body. There are 101 women sitting in the current House of Representatives, 88 Democrats, 13 Republicans, 48 considered to be women of color. The Senate, in the whole history, 41 women have served in that 100-member body. Currently, there are 26 female senators, more than a quarter, 18 Democrats, 8 Republicans. So the numbers are rising, woefully underrepresenting females in the federal judiciary, not just the Supreme Court, but all the way through the lower federal courts, underrepresented in Congress. And of course, as we stand here today, there's still that glass ceiling that has thus far denied the United States, denied women as a gender in the United States, of having either been led by a female president or having had a female vice president serving by the president's side. Will 2020 be the year where part of that glass ceiling is broken? Stay tuned. Time will only tell. So I hope everyone is doing better. I hope that your communities are becoming healthier. And I look forward to the day when we will be able to deliver our presentations once again, up close, personal, and in real time. So to all the women out there and all of the men who love women, mothers, wives, daughters, congratulations at this milestone that we just observed, 100 years following the ratification of the 19th Amendment. See you soon. Take care.